National Federation of Independent Business, which is Pennsylvania's leading small business organization with about 15,000 members here in Pennsylvania. Many of you may be aware our organization was the group that filed the lawsuit against the federal government over Obamacare. Thank you. Today I have the privilege of moderating a panel on unleashing the economic potential of Penn's woods. And we have a very distinguished group of legislators, opinion leaders, and others who are shaping policy not only here for Pennsylvania, about Pennsylvania, but also in Washington, and have some good ideas why free market, pro-growth policies are the key to Pennsylvania's economic future. I'm going to start over here to my right. Charlie Giroux is the founder, or a founder, of the Pennsylvania Leadership Conference. He is currently a CEO of Quantum Communications, which is a nationally recognized strategic communications firm based in Harrisburg. And he also is a local political analyst. You might have watched him on his show on Sunday mornings on the CBS affiliate WHP here in Pennsylvania. To his left, Lori Joint is Director of Government Affairs for the Manufacturers and Business Association. Their offices are based in Erie, but they're a statewide organization, and many of you may know or remember Lori's boss, Ralph Pontillo, who also is a friend of the Pennsylvania Leadership Conference and has presented here many times in the past. To my left is State Representative Brian Ellis, a small business owner and NFIB member. He is serving in the state legislature. And to his left, retired Congressman Phil English, who is the co-chair of the government relations practice at Arndt Fox in Washington, D.C., a 7-term congressman from the city of Erie, and also, to note, an NFIB guardian of small business owner numerous at times. So was Brian, and also our last panelist, State Representative Donna Oberlander. Donna, also a small business owner and former county commissioner. It's interesting to point out both Donna and Brian on our panel. Some of you might refer to them as rising stars. It's really hard to say that because they're leaders right now. And both of them have been involved in key reforms that are taking place in Harrisburg today. A lot of folks look at the accomplishments of the last couple of years and, where is it? Our side, I think, sometimes is a little bit critical of the accomplishments, but we also fail to recognize just how bad conditions were in Pennsylvania just 2 years ago. And whether it's, I think, the most significant change that we have seen in the last 2 years is that we actually have a governor, Tom Corbett, and a Republican legislature who actually believes that Pennsylvania's budget needs to be prepared by the constitutional deadline and that it needs to be balanced. And we can't continue to balance programs on the backs of taxpayers and business and job creators. I think it's also important to note that there have been significant accomplishments in the realm of legal reform in Pennsylvania to return personal responsibility and accountability to our civil justice system as a way of attracting job creators to Pennsylvania, lessening the burdens on those that are trying to do business here, but also to lessen the burdens on taxpayers, whether it's at the state or local level. Certainly there were other accomplishments on the tax and regulatory and policy side, and I'm going to let our panelists talk about those. Earlier today, there was a workshop, and it was focused on the 10th Amendment and states' rights. And I think this conversation is important in that context. Based on the leadership that we have in Washington, D.C. today, it's critical that Pennsylvania, we have to control our own destiny if we're going to make Pennsylvania better. And so this panel today is the whole goal of it is to talk about how we can take free market, pro-growth ideas and make Pennsylvania better. We've worked over the last 2 years to return us to the place where we were, at the end of the 1990s. But what do we need to do to make Pennsylvania better? While we were, languishing, continuing to pile on debt and deficits, raise taxes, our competitor states were reducing their budgets. They were changing the work rules and making their states more competitive for job creators. They also were reducing their tax rates and improving their tax climates. So not only did we have to work to get back to where we were, effectively we had to stop digging the hole, but now we have to work on making Pennsylvania competitive with those competitor states. And this panel today is going to help us and talk about some of those really good ideas. So with that, I would like to introduce State Representative Donna Oberlander, who can come in and talk about what we've accomplished over the last 2 years and offer some ideas on what we can do, her perspective on what we can do to make Pennsylvania better.
Thank you. Thank you, Kevin, and thank you for the opportunity to be part of this panel. I'm going to briefly focus on what state government has done and still needs to do to get government out of the way of private sector, and especially out of the pockets of Pennsylvania's taxpayers and job creators. Perhaps there's no better success story, at least in my mind, of reducing government than the bill that was signed into law during the previous legislative session. It was Act 1 of 2011, and it had to do with the repeal of the sprinkler system that was a mandate for all of our new home construction. Despite estimated costs increasing from $3,000 to $15,000 per new construction, and depending on the size and the design, in December 2009, Pennsylvania became only the second state to implement this non-voluntary international compliance measure. As I argued several times during the committee process and on the House floor, this major issue surrounding the overkill mandate comes both down to a personal and an economic freedom choice. Individual homeowners should be making the decision themselves. Whether or not they want to invest in a sprinkler system is up to them. The bigger picture, Pennsylvania now has greater flexibility in accepting and implementing only the building code changes that actually fit our needs. And I'm pleased that we were able to get that accomplished first act of 2011. For the past 2 years, we've passed the Commonwealth's budget on time, without new taxes and without raising taxes. Now, I realize that passing budgets is not a reason to celebrate. That's what we're mandated to do. That's the job that we've been elected to do. However, I'll remind you that for the past 8 years, that's not what was being done with the previous administration. And as you know, untimely budgets create a ripple effect of uncertainty for county, state agencies, for small and large businesses who don't know what kind of a tax structure they're going to be looking at, increases. I'm proud to be part of a majority party that understands the importance of passing budgets on time and remembering that the money we're allocating through the process comes directly out of the pockets of Pennsylvania taxpayers. Thank you. For the first time in 80 years, the House of Representatives passed a bill privatizing the sale of wine and spirits. And I realize it has a long way to go in the process, but I think those who voted for that, after much negotiation, after much compromise and a lot of hard work, they realize that the private sector almost always does business better than government does. And I'm hopeful that we will continue this process and that there will be new opportunities for private sector to grow and create new jobs. I'll briefly mention some of the other economic unleashing accomplishments that we've done in the past 2 years. We've passed unemployment compensation reforms to help stabilize our unemployment rates, to improve the Commonwealth's job climate, and to get ourselves out of the debt situation that we were in to the federal government. Kevin mentioned some common sense legal reforms like the Fair Share Act, workers' compensation for sole proprietors, regulatory reforms where small business gets the opportunity to actually comment on how those will affect them, public-private partnerships, resource manufacturing tax credits to help Pennsylvania manufacturing heritage offer tax credits to secure a multi-million-dollar petrochemical company, creating hundreds of thousands of jobs in the future. And business tax reforms, making a variety of changes to the state's business tax structure. It was President Ronald Reagan who once said, "No government ever voluntarily reduces itself in size. Government programs, once launched, never disappear." Actually, a government bureau is the nearest thing to eternal life we've ever seen on this earth. I think you would agree. There is still much to be done. Prevailing wage reforms, right to work, pension reform, transportation funding, all are key action items in unleashing the economic potential of Penn's Woods. My favorite is abolishing the Pennsylvania Turnpike Commission. In order to address the critical issue of transportation funding in Pennsylvania, we must eliminate inefficiencies and excess. This past Wednesday, I had the privilege of introducing legislation to completely eliminate the outdated, well-documented, corrupt Pennsylvania Turnpike Commission. If enacted, it would transfer all of the operations, maintenance, construction, and other responsibilities to PennDOT. Comparing the overall effectiveness of both governmental entities is really not much of a debate. PennDOT, run by 7 executives, manages more than 41,000 miles of roadway. That's 1 executive for every 5,800 miles. The Turnpike, on the other hand, has 9 executives, and they're in charge of 545 miles. That's 1 executive for every 60 miles of highway. Additionally, PennDOT uses internal staff to act as government liaisons. The Turnpike Commission hires outside consultants and lobbyists. Regardless of the outcome of the grand jury report and the investigation that just came down with some indictments, I don't believe that there's any reason why this shouldn't have already happened and why Pennsylvania's Department of Transportation isn't doing that job already. I look forward to the passing of this legislation, a reduction in the bureaucracy, a saving of the state taxpayer dollars. Before I conclude my remarks, I want to share what I believe to be a universal truth offered by the late Margaret Thatcher. People want to live in peace, real, lasting peace, the peace that comes from independence of the state and being able to run your own life, spend your own money, and make your own choices. This is the lens that I use in making decisions, and I look forward to your questions and appreciate your gracious attention. Thank you.
Just a reminder for those of you with questions, there are cards on your tables. Please write down your questions. Staff will be around to collect those, and we'll sort through them in the remaining time and get those asked and answered. As I introduce Brian Ellis to come up and speak to you, I think it's important to also note that Brian is the chairman here in Pennsylvania for the American Legislative Exchange Council, Pennsylvania's delegation to ALEC, a free market think tank based in Washington, and a lot of good ideas there. Brian?
Thank you, Kevin, and thank all of you for being here today. I think one of the things that when you walk through the halls out there and you see the different organizations that are out there, the grassroots organizations, I respect so much the work that they do because, quite honestly, any of us that ever get elected start out on a grassroots level. We start going to this small group and that small group, and that's how we can effectively become a leader back in our area. And we know at the end of the day we can't do it without your help and everything that you do on a daily basis. So thank you for that. And as Kevin said, obviously I've received the Small Business Guardian Award from the National Federation of Business, and having come from a third-generation small business family, what was amazing to me when I got elected 8 years ago was how long things take in Pennsylvania to get done. And I'm not just talking about, the regulatory process or anything. I'm just talking about how long things are. The very first term that I was in, it was about the third month. And one of my colleagues stood up on a bill, and I don't remember exactly what the bill was. But when she was done, she thanked all of us for the affirmative vote, and it was going to the governor's desk. And she said, "We have been working on this for 8 years." And I said, 8 years? Oh, my goodness, how do we go and live with that? When you're in business, you make a decision because you have to make the decision now. We can't put it off. And in Pennsylvania, we put decisions off. Last year, we passed a very business-friendly bill for health clubs that I was the prime sponsor on, allowing them to be open 24 hours a day now that folks exercise in different fashion. It's not a 9-to-5 world anymore. A lot of folks go after their kids go to bed. We were the 49th state in the country to do it. And being 49th isn't a great position to be, but over my 8 years, and especially the first 6 under Governor Rendell, we saw we're 47th in this, we're 48th in that, we're 49th. And what we can't continue to do is be a Commonwealth that takes 8 years to get things done. We can't be a government that puts off what we need to do today down the road. Businesses don't do it, and we shouldn't either. One of the other things that I'm excited about these 2 years under the Corbett administration is there is a definite change in the attitude of the way we do business. Under Rendell, it was, let's start at no and then move to yes eventually if they really, really beg us and do everything right. Now under this administration, the attitude is, what's it going to take to get to yes? How can we get there as fast as possible? I'll give you an example. Back home in my district, we have a new veterans hospital being built. Ours is very old. They're building a brand new one. They wanted to do a traffic study. We had just done a traffic study a couple years ago on the same roads and 8 years before that on the same roads. And guess what? This year we didn't have to. We got to yes, and we're getting the job done, and we're doing 500 construction jobs to sustain 400 jobs in our area. That's the kind of attitude that government has to understand and has to implement. And then if I could follow up, Representative Oberlander certainly pointed out the historic vote that we made in the House on liquor privatization, and I was happy with colleagues on the Liquor Committee as well, specifically Representative Mustio and Representative Killian and I spent a lot of time, not just in Pennsylvania, but going to see the way things are done in other states. And time after time, we hear, why is Pennsylvania still one of 2 states that doesn't let the private sector control alcohol sales? And I saw a great sign on the Commonwealth Foundation website today, and it said, liquor privatization. That's so 1920s. And that's what it is. And what's funny is it's not just the private sector taking over the sale of alcohol, which I'm firmly behind and believe they should do. But what else comes whenever you don't have the system we have is the entrepreneurial spirit that Pennsylvania is so famous for and that we're trying to unleash again. Right now, we are desperately behind other states in small businesses manufacturing distilled spirits, craft brews, independent wineries, because of the rules and the regulations that are put in place in front of them that we have to overcome and get into the 21st century. And then finally, as Kevin mentioned, I'm the state chairman for the American Legislative Exchange Council, and many of you know the name. Many of you may have read the stories, and certainly the media loves to print the bad stuff and make it out to be a bad organization because corporations help fund it. That's a factual statement, they do. But you know who doesn't help fund it? Like the other organizations that we could belong to? The taxpayers don't help fund it. Your money isn't being wasted on a national organization. This is private sector money being invested to advance Jeffersonian principles, a free market economy, and the rights of the individuals. So I'm proud to be part of that, and it reminds me, my first term, I was fortunate enough to hear the former Governor Thornburg speak, and one line that he said to me that I've lived with since that day is that he is unapologetically for business. He doesn't look at business, and we don't say, oh, well, this business is bad, but this business is good. Business makes Pennsylvania run. Business makes this country run, and Pennsylvania has to stop hampering business, because they're the ones that provide the family-sustaining jobs. They're the ones that make better communities. They're the ones that invest whenever the government can invest in innovation. They're the ones that we should be for and we should be supporting, and I'm proud to say that I do, and I'm proud to say that I'm a member of the American Legislative Exchange Council. I look forward to your questions. Certainly we have challenging days ahead of us moving forward a pro-business agenda, but I think we've got the right team in place in the House, the Senate, and certainly in the governor's mansion right now to continue the successes we've had that Representative Oberlander pointed out over the last 2 years and move forward even further into the 21st century, and I'm excited to be part of it. Thank you very much.
So that I do not ever be accused of being a leftist, I'm actually going to turn to my right now and introduce Charlie Giroux.
Thank you, Kevin. 35 years ago, there was a book written on the 50 states, and the subtitle underneath the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania was "A State in Magnificent Decline." Those were in the last days of the Schaap administration, I hasten to add, but it went on to detail what had happened in the steel industry, what had happened in all of the Rust Belt across the Northeast United States, and it highlighted Pennsylvania as symbolic of that. But it pointed up to me the difference in philosophy about how you would approach such a situation. Because our friends on the left see life as a series of problems that can best be solved by big government and its bureaucrats. We see life as a myriad of opportunities that can best be seized and manifest by free men and free women and free markets, and a better road can be paved. And so I'm particularly happy to be part of, thank you, I'm particularly happy to be part of this panel today where we're discussing what can be done here in Penn's Woods. And ultimately, it is about seizing those opportunities and the advantages that Pennsylvania has to make those opportunities work for people, to create more jobs and new wealth and a better way of life for all Pennsylvanians. And it begins with, how do we attract investment here? What are the root things that are necessary for us to be a state that is attractive to capital and attractive to investment? We have a lot of advantages. I mean, I could go through them, not only our workforce and our work ethic, our history and our culture, the gas that's beneath us, a literal gold mine under our feet if we properly develop it and deliver it to markets, something that can make us the Saudi Arabia of natural gas for a century to come, and an energy exporter to nations around the world. We've got tremendous opportunities here, but I think it requires some basic and fundamental elements, and I just want to go through them very, very quickly. First of all, it requires political leadership. I want to say what you've already heard from several others today, that the political leadership we have in the governor's office right now is doing the right things for economic growth in Pennsylvania. Not always the popular things, but the right things. And I think we owe them a real debt of gratitude and thanks as they do their job. The second thing goes to one of the points that Representative Oberlander made, and that is eliminating political corruption. If you look at the city of Philadelphia in particular, why is it not a world-class city in every respect? I grew up there, and I know the folks that live there will say, well, it is. But we know that it really isn't. And one of the reasons it isn't is because outside investment, outside capital, outside businesses are put off by the pay-to-play culture that has been endemic there, and that we've promised would be rid, but hasn't yet been done. And look at what's happened in Harrisburg over the course of the past few years, when you literally had a Democratic House Speaker and a Republican House Speaker sharing a cell in a prison. So eliminating the culture of corruption that has been all too frequent in Pennsylvania is essential to our economic growth, as is creating a good business climate. Representative Ellis said it well. It really is about business, because the job creation is done in the private markets. We all know that. And what is required to do that? First of all, it's sensible tax policy. Economics 101 tells us that if you tax something, you get less of it. We don't really need to go too much further than that. We have to have sensible spending policy. And Governor Corbett is the first governor in any of our memories to introduce 2 consecutive budgets that actually cut spending. We cannot spend ourselves to prosperity, at least with other people's money. The spending that's done ought to be done by individual families who are allowed to keep more of what they earn and decide for themselves how best to spend that money. Because ultimately, when the family budget gets bigger and the state and federal government's budgets get smaller, we're all going to be better off for it. And it requires good transportation and, I hate the word infrastructure, but good roads and bridges. That's an issue that's come up, and I know that there's some disagreement even among conservatives. But let me say this, ladies and gentlemen, we have some unique challenges in Pennsylvania. One is climate. We have a freeze and thaw pattern here that's not the same anywhere else in the country. We have some topographical challenges here because we have a lot of rivers, and rivers require bridges to get across them. And we have some location issues. Every truck in the United States probably pours through Pennsylvania at some point or another. We like that, but it does have an impact on our roads. So today we have 5,000 structurally deficient bridges in Pennsylvania and 8,000 miles of substandard roads. That is not only a public safety issue, and God forbid that we should have another situation like we had in Minnesota. But it's also an economic development issue because businesses are not going to stay here and they're not going to locate here if they don't have assurances that their products and services and goods can get to market reliably and safely. Not to mention that there's thousands of jobs to be created if we do the right thing on transportation. And finally, for conservatives, it is a core function of government. That's what government is supposed to be doing. National defense and roads and bridges were the first things that the federal government did 200 plus years ago. But I want to segue real quickly into something that Kevin asked me to chat about just very briefly as one of the people that helped to put together this conference many, many years ago. And that is the importance and significance of conferences like this as the laboratories of ideas, but also the percolators of candidacies and campaigns that ultimately take the conservative movement forward. And I'm so proud of the things that have come out of this conference over the years in terms of the campaigns that have been supported, the ideas that have been created, and the melding together of those to make good public policy. But ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, it requires more than talk. When we leave here this weekend, we will have had numerous conversations. We will have heard myriad speakers from the platform and the podium. But the question then becomes, when we go back to our little pieces of Pennsylvania, what are we going to do about it? And ultimately, we not only have to win elections, we have to be prepared to govern. And that's tough work. And the possibility of doing both of those things, in my judgment, requires that we focus on addition and multiplication rather than subtraction and division. We can be a very comfortable, happy, content minority. Or we can be a somewhat raucous, sometimes uncomfortable, sometimes very dynamic majority. I think it's far better to be in the majority because then you can get things done. And so I far prefer to think of, instead of focusing on who can we primary next, who can we go after in general elections to help shore up the majorities that we already have in the House and Senate with real conservative leaders who will carry the banner forward for economic growth and policies that are sensible on taxes and spending and create opportunities for more wealth, more freedom, and more individual liberty in Pennsylvania than we've enjoyed heretofore, so that this state will never again be regarded as a state in magnificent decline, but rather will be the crown jewel of America and a shining star before all nations in the world. Thank you.
Congressman, I was telling Congressman English a moment ago that his was actually the first campaign that I volunteered for when I came to Pennsylvania as a young college student at Allegheny College, and I volunteered on his first state treasurer's campaign, and I was very proud of having volunteered on his first campaign and his election as congressman from the 3rd District in Erie, Pennsylvania. And what really has always impressed me is that while someone who has made a career later in life in Washington, D.C., how well connected he is to his hometown of Erie and how connected he is to the issues that are affecting Pennsylvania. and I'm sure your presentation, all of us are going to learn the connections between Washington and Harrisburg and why that's important.
I've enjoyed this conference so far, and I've learned a great deal from it. I think, Charlie, that was Neil Pierce who wrote that book. That was an extraordinary book, and honestly, it highlights the fact that in Pennsylvania, we have had a challenge throughout the 20th and coming into the 21st century. It's a challenge in one area where I believe the political right has a clear answer. If there is one thing I've taken out of every single presentation at this conference, is that we are the movement that embraces economic growth. And that, more than anything, is what Pennsylvania needs now to lay the groundwork for a gleaming future. That's also what Pennsylvania needs to demand of our national policies. And as I look across the landscape in Washington, I'm very proud of what the Republican majority is doing in the House. They are very committed to economic growth on a number of different levels, but it is particularly important that they go forward and that we have a strong voice for growth at a time when the national economy seems to be at stall speed. What does that mean? Probably the single policy that could be moved forward that could make a significant difference in economic growth and substantially help states like Pennsylvania is fundamental tax reform. But what I mean by that is a complete rewrite of the code and getting back to fundamentals. We need to simplify it, we need to streamline it. It will never be fun to pay taxes. It will never be fun to fund the costs of government. However, we can do it in a way that is minimally destructive to the economy. And the time is now to move forward. To me, it's stunning. After years have passed since the 1986 Ronald Reagan tax reform, that so many of our competitors have passed us by. And now today, the OECD says that our business taxes are 30% higher than the OECD average. That's a disaster, and that is an albatross around the neck of every company that competes globally in this state. Today, Dave Camp, chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, has almost single-mindedly and nearly single-handedly drove forward fundamental tax reform in this Congress. He appears to have support in the U.S. Senate on a bipartisan basis. He appears to receive lip service from the Treasury of the current administration. But the thing to score tax reform that you need to understand is that on the left and the right, different things are meant by tax reform. In the case of the current administration, the president argues for tax reform, but what he really means is he wants to eliminate loopholes in order to raise taxes. And when he talks about loopholes, he's not very distinct about what he's going after specifically, because some of these tax preferences have specific purposes and have evolved over time. President Obama has already been talking over the past few months, in effect, in raising taxes on entrepreneurship, on energy exploration, on estates, on IRAs, on investment and capital gains. And by arguing the tax reform has to be neutral, the president and his leadership apparently is arguing that there have to be losers as well as winners in tax reform. The tax reform mantle that I'm going to speak for today is one that advocates for changing the code to maximize the potential for economic growth so that we can generate more revenue with lower rates. Ronald Reagan did it. It has been done in the past. We can do that today. And it is critical that we move forward. Tax reform, to me, means rate reduction even as you move forward with base broadening. It means simplification. It means that you're able to reduce the number of tax shelters because you're lowering the rates and therefore requiring fewer tax shelters. In effect, you're cleaning out the system, simplifying it, and reducing its excess burden on the economy. In doing so, we can generate found revenues. We can generate more money with significantly lower rates. And in the process, we can reduce the deadweight loss that occurs when we take money out of the economy because of high rates and direct it to things that are less efficient than what the market would direct it to. What are we looking for from pro-growth tax reform? We expect this year that the House of Representatives will push forward, as Scott Perry indicated, and push for a vote on tax reform. When they put up that vote, we all need to track what is in the bill, how it affects Pennsylvania, and we need to support those who demonstrate that they are committed to tax reform, because it's going to require enormous courage for them to take on the special interests and push for a modern, world-class tax code. What should we be looking for? We should be looking for lower rates. We should be looking for lower capital gains taxes. We've seen 2 different increases in the capital gains tax just in the last few months. That's a disaster, and we know that it generates less revenue over time. We need to preserve the reform of the taxation of dividends. We need to finally and completely repeal the death tax, one of the most anti-growth features currently in the code. We need to repeal the alternative minimum tax, both at the individual and corporate level. They are 2 of the most perverse features that we have currently in the tax code. And on the individual side, we need to expand IRAs, not shrink them the way the current administration is trying to do it. And on the business side, let's understand, it is important as grassroots activists that we advocate for the kinds of reform in business taxation that will make the jobs that we are going to bequeath to our children and grandchildren viable in this country and in this state. We need lower business tax rates. We need to reward cost recovery when businesses invest. We shouldn't hit them with additional tax costs, and that means we need to advocate for expensing, one of the most pro-growth features of the tax code. We need to advocate for proper treatment of R&D, and we need to advocate ultimately for the proper treatment of international income. The issue of territoriality is extremely difficult. I'm not going to explore it here unless you throw it out as a question, but right now, in effect, our current international tax system double taxes American companies on their international income and encourages them in the process to keep their earnings offshore. That's a disaster. We need to encourage them to repatriate their profits globally back to the United States to create jobs here. We also need to be advocates of border adjustability, which means that we take our taxes off at the border, and when other products come into our market, they ought to face an equal and comparable tax. In Pennsylvania, we need to speak for those companies that represent the core of our economy, and that includes manufacturing, and that means strong cost recovery rules. We need to advocate for the technology firms that in Pittsburgh and the Philadelphia suburbs are creating the jobs of the future, and that means adequate R&D. We need to advocate for the natural gas industry, which is going to not only be creating jobs directly in our economy, but improving our competitive position for manufacturing throughout the economy. And that means we need to avoid raising the costs of investing in new production and bringing those new veins of deep gas out of Marcellus and Utica shale to the market. Those are huge capital investments. We need to reward, not punish, those companies that are doing that exploration. We need to advocate for fundamental tax reform now, and although for years, I served 14 years in the House of Representatives on the Ways and Means Committee. We never had an opportunity, even when our party was in control, to have a vote on fundamental tax reform. That vote is finally coming, and we need to insist on it. Thank you. That's what Pennsylvania needs to grow the economy.
Just a reminder, if you have questions, write them on your cards and hand them over to the staff, and we'll go through those after our presentations. And I think Congressman English's remarks are a perfect setup for Lori Joint and learning about what manufacturers would like to see as we improve the economic conditions in Penn's Woods.
Thank you, Kevin. I'm so honored to be here today, serving on this panel with such distinguished and highly respected individuals. And thank you to all of you out there that are sticking it out here till the end. As we're getting close, it seems to clear out a little bit. My work at the Manufacturer and Business Association provides me with direct access to thousands of innovative business owners and entrepreneurs who risk everything in pursuit of the American dream. They are the single most powerful driving force behind our economy. They are the true business creators, the true job creators. I'd like to share their perspective on what can be done to increase and grow the economy here in Pennsylvania. They have 4 key issues: regulatory reform, tax reform, lack of skilled workers, and right to work. Sound familiar? Because we hear the same thing over and over and over again. I'm going to briefly elaborate on each point. First, Pennsylvania's tax climate is not competitive. Tax policy matters to state economic growth. Pennsylvania consistently falls at the bottom of the great states to do business in and ranks in the top worst states for tax burden. Economist Raymond Keating sums it up perfectly, saying, "All taxes matter, whether imposed at federal, state, or local level of government. They matter to consumers, entrepreneurs, investors, and business. They matter in terms of a state's competitiveness, and they matter when it comes to economic growth and job creation." In Pennsylvania, we need to eliminate the cap on net operating loss carry-forwards and lower the overall rate of the corporate net income tax. Our CNI tax rate is the 2nd highest in the nation, and a red flag to existing and potential new businesses about how serious Pennsylvania is about economic growth. Second, businesses in Pennsylvania are overregulated. There are more than 236,000 small businesses in Pennsylvania, and they are heavily burdened with the cost of government regulations and excessive paperwork. In fact, 40% of small businesses are subject to licensing regulations by multiple jurisdictions or levels of government. I want to share just a real quick true life example. This is a small landscaping business in Meadville, PA. They were inquiring about growing their business. I really wish I could share the entire 2-page response requirement permitting letter that they received, but I'll just touch on a few of the highlights. In response to your inquiry concerning the requirements for clearing and grubbing trees from property, you need a written erosion and sedimentation control plan. Appropriate best management practices must be implemented for all stages of earth disturbance. Your E&S plan must also include BMPs to minimize the potential for accelerated erosion. It is your responsibility to ensure that your activities will not impact streams or wetlands. It is recommended that you have a qualified professional assist you in identifying stream and wetlands. Disturbing the ground surface and wetlands is regulated as an encroachment and would require a Chapter 105 permit. If you intend to burn trees or brush, you will need a separate permit. Excavated materials should be handled in accordance with the department's fill policy. Oh, and recommends that you contact the local municipality to see what their requirements are. You can't make this stuff up. If you really want to unleash the economic potential in Pennsylvania, then let's start by unleashing the ropes around the necks of our businesses here. During a time when businesses are uncertain about their future and therefore reluctant to hire and reinvest their earnings, we need representatives in Harrisburg and Washington who understand the high price of overreaching regulations as well as the economic implications of their decisions. Third, lack of a skilled workforce. Hiring a skilled excuse me here, I'm trying to rush, Kevin, so we get done in time. Hiring a skilled and able workforce has been and continues to be a challenge, especially in the manufacturing industry. There are jobs that need filled, but companies can't find people with the skills to fill them. Some of the comments we hear very often are lack of math and science, they can't pass drug tests, or they just really don't want to work. It's definitely critical that we address those problems to continue the growth in Pennsylvania. And fourth, Pennsylvania is not a right-to-work state. Enactment of right-to-work legislation has long been one of our top legislative priorities. The Commonwealth's labor laws breed an environment that restricts employees and empowers unions. As a result, Pennsylvania's economy has failed to maintain adequate job growth and ranks among the least business-friendly states in the nation. Lawmakers should enact reforms that respect employees' rights. They should end the use of taxpayer resources to collect dues and repeal laws that force workers to pay fees to a union as a condition of employment. Anti-business policies have compromised economic growth and undermine the principles of the American free enterprise system. Pennsylvania is blessed with so many resources and has so much to offer. With sound, common sense, free market policies, the sky could be the limit for economic growth potential. I want to leave you with one final thought. Not one of the companies I interviewed or talked to asked for one single thing from government. Not funding, not a program, not a handout. They said, government should provide an economic environment that will allow the private sector to innovate, create, and produce. By doing so, it will unleash the massive economic potential of this great state. In other words, government should stay out of the way and let the private market do what it does best. Because as Ronald Reagan once said, the 11 most frightening words in the English language are, I am from the government and I am here to help. Thank you.
First question for our panelists, and you guys can answer the questions from your tables. Feel free. What do you see are the biggest obstacles for Pennsylvania in achieving these types of important reforms? And maybe if I could start with the elected officials here in Pennsylvania and then open it up to the group. Brian, what do you see are the biggest obstacles preventing us from achieving these important reforms?
Well, I appreciate starting with me. There are certainly big obstacles. Going back to what I said, we don't move fast. And I think what we've seen over the last 2 years is a change in mentality. But certainly one of the underlying factors of why we don't move in a direction is because there are a lot of folks that get to the elected position, like myself or the representative, who then get comfortable. And the folks that are here today, a lot of you are pushing us to stay who we told you we would be. But there are a lot of folks that get comfortable and are willing to just take a little bit. Let's just move a little bit. And I won't ruffle anybody's feathers, and we don't make the bold decisions. So I think, to me, the biggest obstacle we have is folks looking beyond the 5 or 6 emails they get from their district and say, okay, I know these 5 people that I represent don't like this idea. Is this the best for the Commonwealth? And I think the mentality certainly has changed since I came through the doors 8 years ago. I think that there is a strong move in that direction. I think Representative Torzai leading us, and I think Sam Smith in the House specifically have have put us on a path where we're willing to take bolder steps. I mean, the historic vote on getting rid of privatization, the lawsuit reform that we've done, I think we're starting in that direction. And so what it is just continuing to remind people that we're here to make positive change. And I think as the mentality of the legislature changes, and I always said that I would only stay as long as I saw continued progress. And I can say today, we are much better off than we were 8 years ago as far as the way we're doing business. But we have to continue to change the attitudes and get leaders that are less concerned about getting reelected in 2 years as the legacy that they're going to leave for the Commonwealth down the road.
I was just interrupted as you were answering that question and told by our guests, our hosts, that we actually need to wrap up our